So I'll begin by discussing how present bias changes your view of macro, and then I'll talk very quickly about 4 other topics that I think deserve some attention in the conversation about a new macroeconomics, and we'll get to that. So, for those of you who don't know, present bias is a very simple idea. It simply says that rather than having standard exponential discounting, where you would have this delta parameter and then delta exponentiated with each additional period of time as you go into the future, we have this additional wedge by introducing a beta parameter that separates utils that come now and utils that come later. And we think of delta being very close to 1, and we think of beta being maybe about a half. Now, I'll throw in those particular calibrations so you see exactly how things work. Here we see this sharp divide between pleasures that come in the moment and pleasures that come in the future. And we're going to see that that makes an enormous difference in terms of the behavior of individuals and households and the consequences for macro. Now, my favorite example for those of you who don't have familiarity with this framework is exercise. It is my exquisite personal failing, and this example illustrates it. Imagine that exercise has an immediate cost of 6 and a delayed benefit of 8. Will David exercise today? And of course the answer is no, because that present bias parameter beta, which is now a half, is discounting the delayed benefits of exercise. So 6 plus 1/2 times 8, or minus 6 plus 1/2 times 8 is minus 2. I will not exercise today. But how do I feel today, Monday, about planning to exercise on Tuesday? Well, terrific, right? And that's follows right from the model because there's no immediate cost. There's a cost tomorrow of 6, and then a more delayed benefit of 8. They both get discounted by a half because they're both in the future. Net present value plus 1. So David will not exercise today, but David plans to exercise every other day of his life in the future. You can see where that's going. Now, I want to kind of take that back to topics that are relevant for us today and talk about household financial behavior. I want to show you a model that I'm working on with Peter Maxted, Andrea Repetto, and Jeremy Tabachman. The model has a lot of structural ingredients. I'm going to quickly summarize them without kind of going through lots of equations. So there's demographics in the model, there's mortality, there's child dependence, there's adult dependence, there's 3 educational groups, there's stochastic labor income with life course variation, there's a dynamic budget constraint. So there's credit cards with credit limits, and there better be credit cards in a model of households because in the US and more in the UK, it's all about using those credit cards to get by. There'll be liquid and partially illiquid assets in the economy as well. The state variables that we use to solve this model include liquid wealth, illiquid wealth, and autocorrelated labor income. And the preferences are going to be this present bias discounting, sometimes called quasi-hyperbolic discounting, and if you don't like the word bias, you can call it quasi-hyperbolic discounting. We'll focus on the naive case for the cognoscenti among you, and we'll assume constant relative risk aversion. So, what we're going to do is take a bunch of empirical data, in this case from the US, we could do the same thing in the UK, and solve for the preference parameters that most closely generate simulations of the model that reproduce the empirical moments from real data. So what are the empirical moments from real data? We're going to be looking at credit card data and wealth data. Here they are. We're going to do 16 of these moments, as I'll explain how we get 4 to 16. We'll start with the fraction of households that are not paying their credit card balance in full, and we'll study that by decade of life in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and in the 50s. We'll look at the credit card debt divided by average income, and we'll look at that, again, in each 10-year bracket of age. We'll look at wealth divided by average income, and we'll do that for households that are carrying credit card debt. So if you're carrying credit card debt, what is your wealth? And we'll look at wealth divided by average income for households that are not carrying credit card debt. And in this way, we'll end up with 16 moments, and we're going to ask, can our model reproduce those moments? Here are the moments, all laid out, 16 of them. And you see, for households in the US who have a high school education but not a college education, things look pretty scary for them financially. They're under amazing financial duress. So the fraction of households that are not paying their credit card bill in full at the end of the month is about 75%. 3 out of 4 households are carrying credit card debt from month to month. If you take their total credit card debt and divide it by their average income, that number is about 15%. So they're carrying a lot of credit card debt as a fraction of annual income. That's not monthly income. They're carrying 15% of their annual income in credit card debt. If you look at the wealth to income ratio, and this is voluntarily accumulated wealth for people carrying credit card debt, it starts at about 1, and then it rises with each decade of life till about 4 in the 50s. And if you look at wealth for people who are not carrying credit card debt, that ratio starts at around 2 and rises to around 8. So we'd like a model that can reproduce all of these facts, all of this voluntary wealth accumulation with all of this credit card borrowing. Now, here's the estimates using something called the method of simulated moments, which I won't get into. This is the method that kind of asks how do we maximally get the simulated moments in the black column to the left to match the empirical moments, which is the red column to the right. And the parameters that do that are a beta value, this present bias parameter, of about 1/2, the same value I showed you earlier, and a delta, this long-run discounting parameter, that's very, very close to 1. So the model essentially said there's very little long-run discounting, but there's a lot of short-run discounting. Events in the next period are only worth half of what events today are worth in terms of the utility value. And the coefficient of relative risk aversion is rho here, which is very close to log utility. Now, I've just picked out 4 of the moments to show you, but all 16 fit very well. You can see here that the fraction of households having credit card debt is 0.55 in the model for people in the 51 to 60 age bracket, 0.66 in the data. The ratio of credit card debt to income is 0.2 in the model, meaning the model, when it's simulated, produces that level of credit card debt. It's 0.2 in the data. The wealth to income ratio for people carrying credit card debt is 4.3 in the model, and it's 4.2 in the data. And the wealth of people not carrying credit card debt is 7.5 in the model and is 8.1 in the data. So we get our parameters back. Now, if you insist on exponential discounting, you're not going to do nearly as well. The exponential agents, without this present bias or this hyperbolic discounting, in the middle column, you can't get all this credit card borrowing and all this wealth formation at the same time. And so you end up losing on both margins a little bit. The present biased agents in the left column are very, very interesting and very much like people in the real world. They are living hand to mouth. Month to month, they are carrying credit card debt. Month to month, they are barely getting by. They are not sitting on any meaningful stock of liquid wealth, but they've got these big stocks of illiquid wealth, which they accumulate as they pay back their mortgage or they accumulate in their defined contribution pensions. So they're not able to hold on to liquid wealth. They spend that quickly because of their present bias, but they are able to accumulate illiquid wealth because it's illiquid. So difficult to liquidate, and it's less tempting to be spent in the moment. They're not willing to pay the large transaction costs to liquidate those assets. Well, let's think about macro. In a standard exponential discounting model of the sort I just showed you, when you give people more wealth, drop $100 on them, their marginal propensity to consume is only 5%. So fiscal policy is sort of a not very effective instrument in a calibrated version of this classical exponential model. But in the model with present bias, that was the preferred model to the left in the previous slide with beta equal 1/2, now we get much, much higher marginal propensities to consume. These agents, because of their present bias, are liquidity constrained. They're living hand to mouth. When you give them $1, they're very prone to spend a meaningful fraction of that dollar. So their MPC out of $1 of additional wealth is 35 cents. But even if you give them additional liquidity, just let them have a loan, which is not changing their wealth, it's just changing their access to liquidity. Their propensity to consume out of that is 30 cents on the dollar. But if you give them additional illiquid wealth, their MPC out of that is only 5 cents. Now why is that? Because they've got so little liquid wealth, making their illiquid account richer doesn't free them to spend more in the liquid account where there's no margin to spare. So you end up with a world where if you drop wealth on them in the right way, you get a response. And you get a big response. So fiscal policy works when it goes through these liquid wealth channels. But fiscal policy won't work when it goes through these other wealth channels like increasing the value, let's say, of their house or increasing the value of their retirement wealth. Now, in this world, optimal policy is going to be highly paternalistic. In this paper with John Bashairs and James Choi and Chris Harris and Bridget Madrian and Chris Clayton, sorry, I omitted one of the authors, we find that when we solve for the optimal policy of a kind of altruistic government, a government that is not prone to present bias, and that's a strong normative assumption, of course, in that world, the government is going to compel people to do a lot of forced savings, which is exactly the world that we live in. The government's going to have an aggressive Social Security program or a national insurance program, which is what I believe it's called here, which is essentially compulsory savings. Now, formally speaking, when we model this, we write down a two-period model to capture this idea. Household preferences look like this. There's the present bias parameter beta, which you've seen already. There's also this delta parameter capturing kind of the standard discounting. And then there's this Tay-shock, theta. Now, the government can't observe your individual Tay-shock, so the government doesn't actually know what the exactly optimal level of savings is for you, but the government knows that if it leaves it up to you, you're going to mess it up. So in these models, what we find is that as the government tries to create the second best optimal system of savings, it does a lot of compulsory savings for people in the population, explaining why we see those sorts of institutions everywhere in the world, even in the US. Now, formally, we give the government the ability to set up as many accounts as it wants, with as much illiquidity as it wants in every one of these accounts, and then we solve for the optimal system. Turns out the optimal system is very simple. It's essentially a two-account system. This is a world in which there's a lot of heterogeneity in beta. It's essentially a two-account system with one highly illiquid account and one highly liquid account. This system of national insurance increases national welfare on a utilitarian basis the same way that we would increase welfare if we gave everyone 3.4% more permanent income or more wealth. We also find that adding more accounts, making it more complex, essentially has no social value. So just a simple national insurance program with an illiquid compulsory saving system and a liquid account where you can basically splurge is enough to get very close to the first best social optimum. Okay, now I want to quickly talk about other things I'd like to see modern macroeconomics wrestle with that I think are sort of on the A list. First, money illusion. And I want to just give you some quick examples of the sorts of mechanisms that are at play here. This is a wonderful paper by Supreet Kaur, and she illustrates this in India, but these phenomena are just the same when you go and measure them in places with far more levels of education, far higher levels of educational attainment. So here's the question that she asks. Last year, the prevailing wage in a village was 100 rupees per day. This year the rains were very bad, and so crop yields will be lower than usual. So productivity shock. Question A, there has been no change in the cost of food and clothing. Farmers decreased this year's wage rate from 100 rupees to 95 rupees per day. That's a nominal wage cut of 5% in a world where there's zero inflation. 64% of the respondents say this is unfair. Question B, the price of food and clothing has increased so that what used to cost 100 rupees now costs 105, 5% inflation. Farmers keep this year's wage rate at 100 rupees. So this is exactly the same as the previous example in terms of real wages. A 5% cut in real wages. But now only 38% say this is unfair. The third condition goes one step further. The price of food and clothing has increased since last year so that what used to cost 100 rupees now costs 110 rupees, 10% inflation. Farmers increased this year's wage rate from 100 rupees to 105 rupees. Again, a 5% real decline in compensation. Now only 9% say this is unfair. Money illusion is a powerful force. It's missing in most of our models. When we look in the US and try to impute money illusion, we find that it correlates very strongly with levels of education. Among low education households, 45% show money illusion. Among high education households, only 22% show money illusion, but still 22%. Okay, now related to money illusion is another powerful force that we need to, I think, roll into our models. Nominal wages are highly rigid on the downward side. So this is not a symmetric wage rigidity. This is a one-way wage rigidity. Here's some data. Hipsman, 2013. This is a single large firm. We're seeing their performance during a normal year, and you see a cliff at 0, Some people pile up at 0. There's essentially no one below 0 in this data. This is administrative data at this firm. I could show you dozens of firms. This is just illustrative, and they all look this way. Now go to the depths of the Great Recession, and you still see the pile up at 0 and no mass below 0. Firms are extremely reluctant to cut nominal wages, even when they're in the midst of a great crisis, even when their profits are plummeting, even when productivity of their workers is plummeting in terms of the marginal revenue product. Now that creates all sorts of frictions that are going to play out in a lot of unemployment. Here's the illustration of that. In a standard market, you'd go from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 2 during a recession. But with nominal wage rigidity, rather than going to equilibrium point 2 on the previous slide with only a modest decline in employment, now wages are fixed in nominal terms, and you're going to adjust to the new point 2, which is going to be a far larger decline in employment because firms would rather fire people than cut their wages. Cutting their wages is devastating to morale. Firing them hurts their morale, but gets them out of the workplace where they can't do as much damage. Okay, expectations. There's a lot of work on expectations. I could spend a whole talk on this. I'm going to mention a couple papers. Malmandier and Nagel, in a series of papers, show that personal experience drives your expectations. It's not about history. It's not about all the data that's available. It's about what you have personally experienced. There's wonderful work by Andre Schleifer and many collaborators. Here's one paper, Barbaras, Greenwood, Lynn, and Schleifer, trying to understand bubbles through this lens of extrapolative beliefs. I want to focus on another line of work that I've been doing, which is that people fail to anticipate that macro fundamentals have very powerful mean reversion forces in them. Now let me show you some data. This is experimental data. So Rosemary, this is for you. What do you make of this data? So it's highly mean reverting, and it's highly mean reverting at relatively high frequency. This data has the following impulse response function. Every shock is half reversed after 5 periods. Here's the data again. The shocks are half reversed after every 5 periods. Now, when you show that to subjects, they basically can see the mean reversion and they get it. Here's another data process. This data process has the same amount of mean reversion, but it doesn't take 5 periods, it takes 25 periods for the mean reversion to occur. People can't see this mean reversion. So it's still 50% mean reversion in the data, it just takes a long time to play out. Subjects can't see it. In our experimental work, we find that when mean reversion is happening quickly, about 60% of it is recognized by subjects. But when mean reversion is happening slowly, essentially none of it is recognized by subjects. Now here's some real data. This is earnings in the US at the aggregate level, and as you'll see, this is also a highly mean reverting series. Not completely mean reverting, it's not stationary, but there's a lot of mean reversion in this partially integrated process. Now, if you write down an impulse response function for this process, you see that in the short run, after an earning shock, it sticks for a year or two. But in the long run, 3 or 4 years out, that earning shock mean reverts. Now, our approach is to essentially observe that almost all macroeconomic series have a lot of this mean reversion, even when they're integrated. So there can be some permanent components, but there's also a component in this macro series that are mean reverting, and hence the impulse response functions are hump-shaped. So these are hump-shaped trajectories for impulse responses, and you can see in the short run, good news happens. Maybe it even builds in the medium term, but in the long run, whatever macro series you care to estimate, you're going to find, and we've done this in a various set of papers, you're going to find long run, at least partial, if not full, mean reversion. Now, we believe that agents underestimate the degree to which these macroeconomic fundamentals are mean reverting. So that means that the perceived dynamics, let's say here in red, are more optimistic after a positive shock than the true dynamics in blue. Now, what is that going to do in terms of cycles in the economy and excessive volatility in asset markets? It means that, well, why is this true? The reason that people miss the mean reversion is that it's very, very hard to see these low-frequency patterns. You need a lot of data to really reliably see it. And think about what we do in our courses. We don't teach you to run autoregressive integrated moving average processes with 37 variables, we teach you to run an AR1 or an AR2 or a RIMA 111. We teach you to estimate simple processes. And those simple processes, I think now related to the previous session, are going to miss this long-run mean reversion. So if people use the kinds of models we tell them to use, they're not going to see the long-run mean reversion. All the criteria they're going to use for model selection are going to basically tell them to use models that miss the long-run mean reversion. And that means we're going to see the following dynamics in a modern economy. There's going to be good news. Agents will overestimate the long-run persistence of that good news. Asset prices will respond to these beliefs about the long-run persistence of that good news. Consumption will rise because asset prices are rising, because all of this optimism is out there. Investment will rise because people see that, or believe that, all of these good impulses will stick around for a long time. Unfortunately, they don't anticipate the long-run mean reversion, which on average will occur more so than they realized. And at that point, asset prices will fall, there'll be debt overhang, we'll see consumption falling now in a predictable up and down cycle, and we'll see investment falling. And I believe that this lies behind a lot of our modern business cycles, a propensity to overreact to the good news, and then to have to catch up with the bad news when it unexpectedly comes. And of course, this is symmetric. Same thing occurs on the downside. We overreact to the bad news, and then are surprised when things recover, on average. So, this is my proposal for reforming modern macroeconomics. I think we have to understand that consumers are highly stressed and that they're living hand to mouth, and that is due to present bias, and that makes fiscal policy and other types of interventions that give liquidity to households during recessions much more effective than our models say they should be. I think we also have to worry about money illusion, downward nominal wage rigidities and the consequences for unemployment, alternatives to rational expectations, and in particular I've emphasized the propensity for people to misforecast mean reversion, to fail to recognize the degree to which most of these macro fundamentals mean revert very powerfully over long horizons, and then the consequences of all of these misforecasting problems for financial crises of the sort that we've now come through in this 10th year anniversary. Thank you very much.